The Mafia is an Italian word that literally translates to bold or brave. However, anyone who's ever heard of the Mafia knows it has nothing to do with being courageous. In fact, it's quite the opposite. The Mafia are known worldwide for their acts of violence, intimidation, and complete disregard for human life. And whilst most people think of the Mafia as belonging in the past, it's still very much around today, even if it's a little more low-key than it once was. From New York to Sicily and beyond, here are just some of the most feared Mafia bosses that have ever ruled the streets. Charles "Lucky" Luciano. Lucky Luciano was an Italian-American Mafia boss who was one of the most powerful mobsters in the history of organized crime. He was born into poverty in Italy before moving to the United States at the age of 15. As a teenager, he joined the very infamous Five Families of New York, climbing through the ranks until he became the underboss of the Genovese crime family. By the 1930s, he had become a capo regime, which is Italian for head of the regime. This meant that he was basically the boss of all the bosses. During his time as boss, he formed the Commission, which was a sort of governing body made up of the heads of each of the 5 crime families, which helped keep the peace and made sure there wasn't bloodshed between the various families. Even after being sentenced to 50 years in prison, he remained incredibly influential and continued to run the Mafia from behind bars. He was finally released in 1964, but died 2 years later of a heart attack. Don Vito Corleone. You may recognize this name from the Godfather series. Don Vito Corleone is actually based on several real-life Mafia bosses, including Charles "Lucky" Luciano and Joseph Bonanno. Vito is considered to be the most iconic Mafia boss of all time, thanks in no small part to Marlon Brando and then Al Pacino's portrayal of him on screen. Vito rules over his criminal empire with honor and respect, never forgetting where he came from and always looking out for his own. Unlike many of the other bosses on this list, he isn't particularly violent, preferring instead to use his connections and knowledge to get what he wants. He doesn't like to soil his hands, so to speak. But make no mistake, he's not afraid to get violent when he has to. After all, he is the boss. Al Capone. Al Capone was perhaps the most notorious gangster in the history of America. He was the leader of the Chicago outfit, also known as the Chicago Mafia, during the Prohibition era. During his career, he earned the nickname Scarface because of the physical altercation that left him with a permanent scar across his face. But that didn't stop him from becoming the most successful gangster of the 1920s. When alcohol was outlawed, Capone saw it as a chance to earn lots of money and power. His gang sold illegal liquor and bootleg products to the masses, making him a fortune. This led to him controlling much of the city of Chicago and having direct influence over politicians, police, and judges. His violent crimes finally caught up with him when he was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison for tax evasion. He was eventually paroled in 1939, but he suffered from syphilis, which caused him to have a stroke. He died a few years later in 1947 at the age of 48. Meyer Lansky. Meyer Lansky was a Russian-American mobster who was one of the most powerful men in organized crime, despite never actually committing any violent acts himself. He was involved in almost every major crime racket in the United States during the mid-20th century. He was a member of the Jewish-American Mafia, also known as the Kosher Nostra, and was one of the first mobsters to realize that there was more money to be made in white-collar crime than in street crime. Instead of getting his hands dirty with violence, he preferred to sit at a desk and count his money. It was rumored that he was the mastermind behind the 1978 Lufthansa heist, which saw $6 million stolen from a New York airport, though he was never convicted for it. The FBI suspected him of laundering much of the mob's money through casinos in Cuba, which they proved by bugging his hotel room and listening in on conversations. He was arrested and charged with conspiracy and tax evasion, but he managed to get off with just 10 years probation. He continued to evade the FBI for the rest of his life, but it's thought that he died of cancer in 1983. Joe Masseria was one of the most powerful mobsters in the early days of organized crime in the United States. He was the head of the Masseria crime family, one of the 5 main crime families of New York, and was a major player in the Castellamoris War. This was a bloody battle between rival Italian gangs in the 1920s and 1930s, and Masseria came out on top, leaving him in control of most of the rackets in the United States. However, his reign didn't last long. In 1931, he was shot and killed by a rival mobster, Frank Tieri. Frank Tieri was a high-ranking member of the Lucchese crime family, one of the 5 main crime families of New York. He was the underboss of the family from 1957 to 1980, and then became the boss until his death in 1981. During his time as boss, he was involved in a lot of illegal gambling and narcotics trafficking. He was also a major figure in the Mafia Commission, which was a sort of governing body made up of the heads of each of the 5 crime families. Despite being a powerful and ruthless mobster, he was never convicted of a crime. He was arrested several times but always managed to beat the rap. He was eventually sentenced to 6 years in prison for extortion, but he died of cancer before he could report to prison. Joseph Bonanno. Joseph Bonanno was a Sicilian-American mafia boss who was the head of the Bonanno crime family, one of the 5 main crime families of New York. He was born in 1905 and grew up in poverty. He moved to the United States when he was 13 years old and quickly got involved with the Mafia. He worked his way up through the ranks and became a capo regime, which is Italian for head of the regime. This meant that he was basically the boss of all the bosses. However, unlike some of the other bosses on this list, he was a bit of a loose cannon. He was hot-headed and unpredictable, which often got him into trouble. He was also a bit of a gambler, and this cost him dearly. In 1964, he disappeared for 4 years, which only added to his mystique, and rumors that he was dead began circulating. He eventually resurfaced in 1968 and claimed that he had been hiding out in Italy. He was eventually sentenced to 15 years in prison for narcotics trafficking. But he was released early in 1978. He died in 2002 at the age of 97. Anthony Fat Tony Salerno. Anthony Fat Tony Salerno was an Italian-American mafia boss who was the head of the Genovese crime family, one of the 5 main crime families of New York. He was born in 1897 and grew up in poverty. He joined the Mafia as a teenager and worked his way up through the ranks. He became a capo regime in 1957 and then became the boss in 1962. During his time as boss, he expanded the Genovese crime family's rackets into new areas such as Las Vegas and Miami. He was also a major player in the Mafia Commission, which was a sort of governing body made up of the heads of each of the 5 crime families. He was arrested several times, but always managed to beat the rap. In 1976, he was convicted of racketeering and extortion and sentenced to 100 years in prison. This was later reduced to 40 years. Died in 1982 at the age of 85. Santo Trafficante Jr. Santo Trafficante Jr. was an Italian-American mafia boss who was the head of the Trafficante crime family. This was one of the 5 main crime families of New York. He was born in 1914 and grew up in poverty. He joined the Mafia as a teenager and worked his way up through the ranks. He became a capo regime in 1957 and then became the boss in 1966. During his time as boss, expanded the Trafficante crime family's rackets into new areas such as Las Vegas and Miami. He was also a major player in the Mafia Commission, which was a sort of governing body made up of the heads of each of the 5 crime families. In 1975, he was convicted of narcotics trafficking and sentenced to 20 years in prison. However, he was released in 1984. He continued to run the crime family from the shadows until his health began to fail. He died in 2005 at the age of 90. Michael Franzese. Michael Franzese is one of the most successful mobsters of all time. He was a high-ranking member of the Colombo crime family and was involved in a lot of illegal gambling and narcotics trafficking. He was also a major player in the Mafia Commission, which was a sort of governing body made up of the heads of each of the 5 crime families. However, unlike some of the other mobsters on this list, he wasn't just a regular old criminal. He was a bit of a businessman too. He understood the importance of diversifying your income and wasn't afraid to get involved in legitimate businesses. In fact, he was so successful at this that at one point he was making $1 million a week. However, his luck eventually ran out. In 1986, he was convicted of racketeering and extortion and sentenced to 10 years in prison. He was released in 1994 and has since written several books about his life as a mobster. Now you need to watch Who's the Boss, Italian Mafia vs. Japanese Yakuza, or have a look at Worst Mafia Bosses.